The day Evelyn Hart walked into the middle of a crowd of desperate women and told the most wanted man in the valley to stay the hell away from her, nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. The silence that fell over Blackthorn Ridge was the kind that comes before something breaks. Colt Mercer had land, cattle, and more marriage proposals than he could count. Every family in the valley wanted a piece of him. But Evelyn, broke, alone, carrying a past that could crush a lesser person, turned her back and walked away. That one moment set everything in motion. And by the time it was over, nothing in that valley would ever be the same. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came to Blackthorn Ridge the way it always did. Hard and dry, pressing down on the land like a thumb on a bruise. The grass along the creek beds yellowed by June. The cattle moved slower. The wells that old-timers swore would never run dry started showing their bottom stones for the first time in anyone's memory. It was the kind of summer that reminded people they were out here at the land's permission, not their own. But none of that seemed to touch Colt Mercer. His ranch, the Double M, 7,000 acres running from the base of Blackthorn Ridge all the way east to the edge of Sutter's Flats, was one of the few operations in the county that wasn't bleeding. His cattle were fat, his fences were tight, his water rights on the Coldwater Creek tributary were registered, paid, and uncontested. While other ranchers were skipping meals and lying awake at night running numbers that didn't add up, Colt was adding hands to his payroll. He was 34 years old. He wasn't a large man, medium height, lean through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered hands that told the truth about how that ranch had been built. He hadn't inherited the Double M intact. His father had left him 40 acres and a 2-room shack with a bad roof, and Colt had worked every other acre into existence over the course of 12 years. He'd done it mostly without asking for help, which was either a virtue or a character flaw, depending on who you asked. The town of Delwood sat 12 miles south of the Double M, at the base of the valley where the old stage road forked toward the territorial capital. It wasn't a large town, maybe 400 people if you counted the outlying homesteads, but it had everything a working rancher needed: feed store, blacksmith, a general store run by a man named Hargrove, whose prices were unreasonable but whose credit terms were generous, a saloon called the Ironwood that served 3 grades of whiskey and 1 grade of beer, all of them passable, a church that most people attended once a year out of social obligation, a small hotel that was usually half empty. It also had, every summer, the Delwood Community Gathering, 3 days of trading, eating, competitive events, and the kind of concentrated social pressure that made some people look forward to it and made others think seriously about being somewhere else that week. This year, the gathering had a specific undercurrent that everyone felt but nobody stated outright. Colt Mercer was unattached. He had been for 2 years since a brief, difficult courtship with the eldest Pemberton daughter had ended without anyone talking much about why. He was successful, he was landowner, he was not unkind, and in a valley where those 3 qualities in a single unmarried man were increasingly rare, his presence at the gathering had acquired the weight of an event. Buy him? He arrived on the first morning with his foreman, a weathered Montana man named Del Pruitt, who had been with the Double M for 9 years, and who regarded most social situations with the same expression he reserved for unexpected weather. "You know what this week is going to be," Del said, as they tied their horses outside the feed store. "I know what people are hoping it'll be," Colt said. "Same thing." "Not necessarily." Del looked at him. "Meredith Calloway is already here. Her mother has been rearranging the seating at the supper table since yesterday afternoon." Colt picked up his saddlebag and said nothing. The gathering spread across the flat ground at the edge of town. Temporary stalls, trestle tables, a roped-off area for the horse work that would happen on the second afternoon. Families had come in from 20 miles in every direction, some of them sleeping in their wagons rather than pay the hotel rate. Children ran between the stalls. Old men sat in whatever shade they could find and discussed the dry summer in the tone people use when they're worried but don't want to say so directly. Within an hour of his arrival, Colt had spoken to 3 different fathers whose daughters had somehow materialized nearby during the conversation. He was polite to all of them. He knew how to be polite. It was something his mother had drilled into him early, and he'd never lost it. But politeness and interest weren't the same thing, and by the time he'd extricated himself from a 20-minute conversation with Warren Calloway about the future's price on beef cattle, He had the particular exhausted feeling of a man who has been managed without being obviously managed. He found Dell at the edge of the livestock pens, watching a group of horses being led in through the back gate. "I need coffee," Colt said. "Supper's at 6. The Calloway women have been told you're attending." "Who told them that?" "You said you were going to the supper." "I said I'd probably go." Dell shrugged. Probably and yes are the same word when Meredith Calloway's mother is involved. Colt looked out at the horses coming through the gate and let the subject drop. He watched the animals move, the way they tested the unfamiliar ground, the way the younger ones stayed close to whatever horse they'd traveled with. He'd always found horses easier to read than people. They showed you what they were. Then one of them stumbled. It was a sorrel mare, 3 or 4 years old, still green enough that the noise and crowds were making her nervous. She had her head up too high and her weight too far back, and when a child shrieked nearby, she sidestepped hard and caught her left foreleg against the fence rail. Not badly. She didn't go down. But she lurched, and the lead rope went taut, and the man holding it yanked back, which was exactly the wrong response. The horse threw her head, planted her feet, and wasn't going any further. The handler, a young hand, probably hired for the week, clearly unsure what to do, yanked the rope again. "Don't," said a voice. Colt turned. The woman who had spoken was standing at the fence to his left, watching the scene with her arms folded. She was not anyone he recognized immediately, and in a valley where he knew most faces, that registered. She was somewhere in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back into a loose braid and the kind of clothes that said she worked: canvas trousers, a worn linen shirt, boots that had seen real use. She wasn't watching him. She was watching the horse. She pushed off the fence and walked through the gate without asking anyone's permission. "Give me the rope," she said to the handler. The young man looked uncertain. "She's been like this since we—" "I know." She took the rope from his hand and immediately let it go slack. She turned slightly away from the mare, not looking directly at her, and just stood there. The horse's ears moved. She took one step, then stopped. The woman waited. Colt watched. Dell had appeared at his shoulder without him noticing. The mare dropped her head slightly. The woman reached out one hand, not toward the horse's face, but toward her neck, low and slow, and the mare turned toward it on her own. It took maybe 2 minutes. When it was done, the mare was walking alongside the woman as calmly as if they'd known each other for years. "Huh," Dell said. Colt said nothing, but he stayed at the fence until the woman had handed the rope back to the handler and walked away toward the far end of the pens without looking at anyone. Her name, he found out over the next hour by asking carefully indirect questions of various people, was Evelyn Hart. She ran a small horse training operation on a leased property about 6 miles north of town, near the base of the ridge. She'd been in the valley for about 2 years. She was not from here originally. Someone said she'd come up from Wyoming. Someone else said New Mexico. Nobody seemed entirely sure. She didn't talk about herself much. Nobody said anything bad about her work. 2 ranchers he spoke to had sent horses to her and gotten back animals that were a full grade better. But nobody said much else about her either, which, in Colt's experience, sometimes meant a person kept to themselves, and sometimes meant something more complicated. He thought about going to find her. He didn't, not right away. He went to lunch instead, sat at a table where the Calloway women were not, and ate his food and listened to the talk around him, which was almost entirely about the dry summer and what it was going to mean for the fall. The supper happened at 6 o'clock, as promised, at the long trestle tables set up in the lot behind Hargrove's store. Lanterns were strung. Someone had brought a fiddle and there would be music later. The food was the kind that took all day to make: roasted beef, corn, summer squash, bread, 2 or 3 kinds of pie. Colt sat where he was placed, which turned out to be near the Calloway family, though not close enough to be obvious about it. Meredith Calloway was 23, pretty in a conventional way, and had been to a finishing school in Denver that her father mentioned in the first 10 minutes of conversation. She was pleasant. She was composed. She said all the right things. Colt answered her questions and asked a few of his own, and felt throughout the entire meal the mild, persistent sensation of doing something out of obligation rather than interest. Halfway through the supper, he looked down the table and saw Evelyn Hart sitting near the end, alone, except for a woman he didn't recognize, eating without any particular interest in the conversation around her. She looked up once, and their eyes met, and she looked away first. The horse competition was on the second afternoon. It was a simple event, a green horse, a set course, and whoever could get the animal through it cleanest in a set time. Not racing, not trick riding, just horsemanship. 3 men entered. Then, with no particular announcement, Evelyn Hart entered. There was a murmur. Not hostile exactly, but present. The first 2 men did well enough. The third, a rancher from the east end of the valley named Briggs, had a horse that didn't want to take the water crossing and cost him half a minute wrestling it through. He came off the course red-faced. Then Evelyn rode in. The horse she was on was not impressive to look at. A plain brown gelding, a little short in the back, not young, but she sat him easy, with no unnecessary movement, and when they started the course it became apparent within about 30 seconds that something different was happening. She wasn't pushing the horse. She wasn't correcting it. She was barely visible in what she was doing, which was the point. And the horse moved through the course with the kind of confidence that comes from an animal that actually trusts its rider. She finished 2 full minutes faster than the best time. There was applause, genuine, if slightly surprised. She dismounted and walked the horse out without acknowledging much of it. Colt was watching from the fence again. He'd been watching from the fence a lot, he realized. He pushed off and walked around the edge of the competition area toward where she was cooling the gelding down. "That was a good run," he said. She looked at him, not unfriendly, but not warm. "Thank you. I'm Colt Mercer. I know who you are." He waited a beat. "I saw what you did with that mare yesterday, at the gate." "She was scared," Evelyn said. "People kept making it worse." She ran a hand along the gelding's neck, checking his breathing. "Where'd you learn that?" She glanced up at him. "Learn what?" "That patience." She considered him for a moment, and there was something measuring in it, not rude, but careful, the way you look at something before you decide whether to trust it. "You didn't come over here to ask me that. I came over here to introduce myself. You already did that." She picked up her lead rope. "Mr. Mercer, Colt, Mr. Mercer." She said it the first way and meant the correction to land, and it did. "I don't have anything against you personally, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't make a habit of coming around." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "I've heard about you, and I don't mean anything unkind by it." She looked at him directly, and her voice was level, not angry, not flustered. "But I have work to do, and I don't need the kind of attention that follows you around right now. It's not a good time for me." He stood there for a moment, genuinely unsure what to say to that. Nobody had said anything like that to him in a long time. Maybe ever. "I haven't done anything," he said, and he heard how it sounded, slightly defensive, slightly baffled. "I know," she said. "I'm asking you before you do." She nodded once, politely, and led her horse away. Colt watched her go. Dell materialized at his left shoulder. The man had an uncanny ability to appear at inconvenient moments. "That went well," Dell said. "Shut up, Dell. She told you to leave her alone before you even opened a full conversation." "I heard it. Most women are standing in line trying to get your attention, and that one just... Dell. I'm just saying it's interesting." Colt turned and walked back toward the main area, but the feeling in his chest, not quite irritation, not quite curiosity, something that lived somewhere between the two, didn't go away. What? That evening, he sat in the ironwood with Dell and 2 other ranchers from the north end of the valley, a man named Garrett Finch and his older brother Roy, who ran adjacent operations and rarely agreed on anything except their opinion of the whiskey at the ironwood, which was that it was overpriced. The conversation ran as it always did that summer, to water and land and money. "Paxton's selling," Roy Finch said. He was the older of the 2, with a gray beard and the careful speech of a man who weighed his words. "He hasn't announced it, but he's selling. The note came due in April, and he couldn't cover it." "Who's buying?" Colt asked. Roy shrugged. "That's what I don't know. There's been men in suits out there twice in the last month. Not from the valley. I didn't recognize either of them." "Outside investors," Garrett said, with the tone of a man who had a settled opinion about outside investors. "Maybe," Roy turned his glass. "Paxton's not the first. Henderson sold off 200 acres in May. Said he got a fair price, but he looked like a man who'd made the best of a bad situation. Not a fair deal." Colt knew Henderson. He was a careful man, not given to bad situations. "There's land moving in this valley," Roy said. More than there should be in a single season. I don't know what it means yet. Dry summer, Garrett said. People make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. Maybe, Roy said again. He sounded unconvinced. Colt drank his whiskey and turned the conversation over in his mind without adding much to it. He'd noticed some of what Roy was describing. Properties changing hands, unfamiliar faces in Delwood on days that weren't market days. He hadn't put a shape to it yet. He walked back to the hotel alone that night, the summer dark warm around him and the stars thick overhead, the way they only got when you were far enough from any city to see them properly. He thought about the dry creek beds. He thought about the water rights he'd been smart enough to lock down early, before he'd known to be careful about it. He thought, without quite intending to, about Evelyn Hart and the direct way she'd looked at him and told him to stay away. He'd met a lot of people in his life. Most of them wanted something from him, one way or another, and he'd gotten good at seeing it. She hadn't wanted anything. She'd wanted less than nothing. She'd wanted him to be absent. He lay in his hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and could not fully explain why that bothered him as much as it did. He found out the next morning, indirectly. He was at Hargrove's store buying a replacement buckle for a bridle when he overheard two women talking in the dry goods section. He wasn't listening deliberately, but the store was small and they weren't quiet. Apparently she's behind on the lease, one of them said, a woman he recognized as the wife of one of the smaller ranchers on the south end. Briggs told Henry that Wheeler's been patient about it, but he can't carry her indefinitely. What does she do out there? The other woman said. Trains horses, but the operation's small. I don't think she has more than 4 or 5 animals at a time. That can't pay enough to... No, it doesn't, which is why... A pause, and something in the pause suggested what came next wasn't meant to be kind. She was doing better for a while from what I understand. Had some kind of arrangement with a ranching family down south, but something happened there, but nobody really knows what, and she came up here with basically nothing. She's proud, the second woman said in a tone that made it sound like a failing. Too proud for her own good, probably. They moved on to something else. Colt paid for his buckle and left. He stood in the street outside Hargrove's for a moment, in the already warm morning, and understood something about what Evelyn Hart had said to him the day before. The attention that follows you around. She hadn't been talking about flattery or social inconvenience. She'd been talking about not being able to afford the complications that came with being noticed by a man like him. The talk, the assumptions, the way people in small communities made something out of nothing, and then behaved as though the something was real. She was behind on her lease. She was operating alone. She didn't need people deciding what she was doing with Colt Mercer. He didn't go looking for her that day. He finished his business at the gathering, spoke to the people he needed to speak to, and rode back to the Double M in the afternoon heat with Dell alongside him and the valley spread out quiet and dry in every direction. You're thinking, Dell said. I'm always thinking. You're thinking about something specific. Colt didn't answer for a while. The horses moved at a steady walk, raising small puffs of dust on the road. How well do you know the Hart operation? He said finally. The woman who trains horses? Dell considered. Not well. I know she's good. Heard it from 2 different people I trust. Small outfit, leased land, works alone. You heard anything else? Dell looked at him sideways. I've heard she doesn't like being talked about. That's not the same as not having things to talk about. No, Dell agreed. It's not. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and the ridge rose dark and steady to the north, and the valley lay patient and dry beneath the summer sky, holding whatever it was holding. He didn't go to see her the next week, or the week after. He had work, a fence line that had been damaged by a runoff channel shifting during the spring, a dispute with a neighboring hand about grazing rights on a strip of shared borderland, the ongoing daily work of running 7,000 acres with 12 hired men and 1,000 head of cattle. But he asked questions, carefully, without drawing attention to what he was asking. He was good at that. He'd always been a patient, methodical man, which was part of why the ranch had grown the way it had. He asked questions and he listened, and he assembled what he heard into something that had a shape to it. What he learned about Evelyn Hart. She had come from a ranching family in New Mexico. Her father had run a respectable operation there for 20 years. About 4 years ago, the operation had failed, quickly, in a way that people described as surprising. The family had lost everything and scattered. Her father had died within the year. One brother had gone east. She had gone north, worked for a ranching family in Wyoming for a year and a half, saved what she could, and come to Blackthorn Valley 2 years ago with enough money to lease a small property and establish herself. She was not known to make friends easily. She was not unfriendly. People who dealt with her professionally respected her. But she didn't seek company, and she didn't invite questions. She'd had one conflict with a local man, a rancher named Briggs, about a horse she'd been hired to train. The details were unclear, but the outcome was that Briggs had stopped hiring her and had said unspecified things about her reliability to other ranchers, which had cost her at least 2 other clients. She was, by most accounts, excellent at what she did, and bad at everything surrounding it. He thought about the dry summer of 1883, about Roy Finch's careful words about land moving in the valley, about properties changing hands and men in suits appearing without explanation. He thought about a ranching family in New Mexico that had failed quickly and surprisingly 4 years ago. He didn't connect all of it yet, but the shape of it sat in the back of his mind like a stone in a boot, not sharp enough to stop you, but present enough that you couldn't forget it. 3 weeks after the gathering, on a morning when the heat had broken slightly and the air smelled like the possibility of rain, Colt Mercer rode north toward the base of Blackthorn Ridge, took the cutoff road past Wheeler's property line, and turned onto the leased land where Evelyn Hart kept her operation. He told himself he was in the area. He was not particularly in the area. The property was modest: a small house, a good-sized training corral, a 4-stall barn. Everything looked maintained but not lavish. A garden against the south wall of the house that was putting up a fight against the dry summer. A water trough that was full. She was in the corral when he rode in, working a young bay horse on a long lead. She was watching the horse, not him, and he wasn't sure she'd heard him come up until she turned her head slightly and said, without stopping what she was doing, "Mr. Mercer." "I said I wouldn't make a habit of it," he said. "One visit isn't a habit." She kept her eyes on the horse. "What do you want?" He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence and stood there for a moment, hat in his hands, which was an uncommon posture for him. "I want to know about your family's ranch in New Mexico," he said. "The one that failed." The long lead went still in her hands. The bay horse slowed and stopped, looking at her. She turned then, fully, and looked at him with an expression that was not readable. Not angry, not surprised, something flatter than either. "Why?" she said. "Because I think I know what happened to it," he said. "And I think it's happening here, and I think you know it too." The silence that followed was long enough for the horse to drop his head and start pulling at the thin grass near the fence post. "Come inside," she said finally. Her voice was not warm, but she said it. Much. The inside of the house was spare but clean. A table, 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves with books and tools mixed together without particular order. A saddle in the corner that was being repaired, a tin cup of dried wildflowers on the windowsill that was probably the only decorative object in the building. She poured 2 cups of water from a pitcher and set one in front of him and sat across the table with the other. She didn't offer food, and he didn't expect it. "Talk," she said. "Roy Finch told me 3 weeks ago that land has been moving in this valley at an unusual rate," Colt said. "Properties changing hands, men in suits appearing, ranchers taking deals they wouldn't normally take because of the dry year making them desperate. Henderson sold 200 acres, Paxton selling his whole operation." He paused. "Who are the buyers?" She wrapped her hands around her cup. "A land company," she said. "They operate under at least 3 different names. Territory Consolidated Land was the one they used in New Mexico. Up here I've heard them called Northwest Range Holdings." "You've been tracking them?" "For 2 years." Her voice was flat. "I came up here partly because I heard the name Northwest Range mentioned in connection with a property dispute in Cheyenne. I followed it." Colt leaned forward slightly. "And?" "It's a scheme," she said. "A land fraud scheme. They identify valleys, places with good water, good cattle land. They look for properties that are financially vulnerable. They manufacture pressure. Sometimes they interfere with water rights documentation. Sometimes they use debt. Sometimes they just wait for a dry year." She looked at him steadily. "They offer to buy at prices that seem fair when you're desperate. They acquire a certain number of properties. Then they manipulate the land claim records. There are territorial clerks involved, 2 that I've identified, and they sell consolidated parcels to large outside investors at several times what they paid. And the original owners are gone by then. She paused. The fraud is in the documentation. The claims look legitimate on paper. By the time anyone notices the original deed records don't match, the scheme operators have moved on to the next valley. Colt sat with this for a moment. You have proof. Some. Her jaw tightened. Not enough. Not yet. She looked down at her cup. In New Mexico, I had more. I went to the county authorities. I went to my father's lawyer. I was 24 years old, and I thought if you had evidence and you told the right people, it would matter. Her voice didn't crack. It was, if anything, more controlled. They didn't believe me. Or they believed me, and it didn't make a difference, which is worse. My father lost everything. He filed an appeal, and they tied it up in process until there was nothing left to appeal for, and then he was done. He died, Colt said carefully. The year after, she said. He wasn't sick, he was just finished. She said it with a precision that was worse than if she'd cried about it. I'm sorry, Colt said. Don't be, she said, not unkindly. Be useful instead. He looked at her across the table. There was something about her that was different from most people he talked to. A directness that didn't perform itself. That just was. She wasn't trying to convince him of anything or manage his response. She was telling him the truth and waiting to see what he did with it. What kind of proof do you have? He said. Letters. A set of property maps that don't match the registered versions. A document from the New Mexico dispute that shows the same clerk's signature appearing in 2 different territories. She paused. And I've identified one of the men running the local operation. He's been in Delwood 3 times in the last 4 months. Goes by the name Aldous Crane. Colt stilled. I've met Aldous Crane, he said. She looked at him. When? 2 weeks ago. He came to the Double M, said he represented a territorial land improvement association. Said they were interested in acquiring water rights from ranchers who might want to liquidate. He paused. I told him I wasn't interested. Something moved across Evelyn's face. Not surprise exactly, but confirmation. They went to you directly. That's new. She set down her cup. They usually avoid the large, stable operations until late in the process. If they're already approaching you, they're moving faster than you expected. Yes. The light through this window was the flat gold of mid-morning, and the horse outside in the corral moved occasionally, the sound of its hooves muffled by the dry ground. Colt looked at the tin cup of dried flowers on the windowsill and thought about Paxton, about Henderson, about Roy Finch's careful voice. You went to someone with what you had, he said. Local authorities. Her expression answered before she did. Deputy Holt told me I was mistaken. Hargrove, the store owner, who also sits on the town council, told me that making accusations against legitimate businessmen wasn't something he could take seriously. Briggs, she stopped. Briggs, who has the property east of Wheeler's. Yes. Her mouth went thin. Briggs told me to my face that he didn't know what I thought I was doing, but that spreading stories about land fraud was the kind of thing that made people unwelcome in a community. She met his eyes. And then he started telling other ranchers that I was unreliable, which cost me clients, which is why I'm behind on the lease. Colt put it together quietly. Briggs had been approached too, probably, or Briggs owed someone something. Or Briggs was simply the kind of man who aligned himself with power whenever he sensed it. Nobody believed you, he said. Nobody who mattered, she said. The ranchers who are going to lose their land don't know what they're facing yet. By the time they do, it'll be too late to fight it. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post and complained about something and flew away. I believe you, he said. She looked at him, not with gratitude, with the look of someone who has been burned enough to be careful even about good news. Why? She said again. Because Roy Finch is a careful man and he's worried. Because Aldous Crane came to my ranch and made me an offer and his hands were too clean for a man in land improvement. Because everything you're describing is the kind of thing that works exactly the way you're describing it, and I've seen enough dishonesty in business to recognize the outline. He leaned back in his chair. And because you don't have anything to gain from making this up. She was quiet for a moment. You understand, she said slowly, that if you stand up with me on this, You'll lose the support of people you've known for years. They won't believe it either, not at first. They'll say I put ideas in your head or that you're protecting some kind of interest. The people who are already working with Crane will turn against you. I understand that, Colt said. And your ranch? Nobody's taking my ranch, he said. It came out flat and certain, not angry, just true. She studied him for a long time. Long enough that it became a kind of assessment. She was deciding something. He could see it. She wasn't a person who made decisions quickly and then regretted them. She was a person who was thorough about it the first time. I need more evidence, she said finally. The clerk records in the county seat are the key. If I can get copies of the original deed filings and show the discrepancies, it becomes something a territorial judge can't ignore. Can you get to those records? I've been trying, she said, but the clerk's office is not cooperative, and I'm one woman working alone. It's easy for them to be busy whenever I come in. Colt stood up and picked up his hat from the table. I'll come with you to the county seat. She looked at him with that measuring expression again. I'm not looking for thanks, he said. I'm looking to keep this valley intact. That's a thing worth doing. He turned toward the door and paused. And for what it's worth, I heard what you said at the gathering. I'm not here about that. I know, she said, and for the first time her voice had something in it that wasn't armor. He walked out into the dry summer morning, untied his horse, and rode back toward the Double M with the mountain ridge standing dark and solid against the sky, and the valley spread out below it, green in the creek bottoms and yellow everywhere else. And something had shifted, not dramatically, not cleanly, but genuinely. The way things shift when you've made a decision that you already know is going to cost you something, and you've made it anyway. He didn't look back at the property as he rode away. He didn't need to. The county seat was a 2-day ride east, through the dry flats and up over a low pass where the pine trees started and the air cooled enough that you could almost forget it was August. Colt had made the trip a dozen times over the years, for registration filings, for water rights disputes, for the ordinary bureaucratic maintenance that land ownership required. He'd never minded the ride. It gave him time to think. This time, he wasn't alone. Evelyn rode a compact gray horse that moved efficiently and without complaint, which suited her. She wasn't a talkative travel companion, which also suited him, though he noticed on the first morning that her silence wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the silence of someone who had learned not to fill space with words just because space was available. He'd met enough people who couldn't do that to recognize it as a quality. They camped the first night in a dry creek bed where a cottonwood had fallen across the bank and made a natural windbreak. She built a fire without asking if he wanted one, which he appreciated. They ate the food they'd brought, dried beef, hard bread, dried apples, and drank coffee that was too strong and sat with the fire between them in the cooling night. How long have you been carrying this alone? He said. It wasn't quite a question. She poked at the fire with a stick and didn't answer right away. Since before I left New Mexico, she said finally. About 3 years. That's a long time. Yes. She didn't say it with self-pity. She said it with the tone of a person reviewing a fact. I thought for a while that I needed to get further away from it before I could do anything useful. That I was too close. She paused. That was wrong. The distance just meant I lost time. Colt turned his coffee cup in his hands. Did you ever think about stopping? Just letting it go? She looked at him across the fire. My father died with nothing. Everything he built, gone. Not because he made bad decisions, because someone decided his land was worth stealing and found a way to do it. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. So, no, I didn't think about stopping. He nodded and didn't push it further. He understood that kind of accounting, the kind where you owe something to a person who can't collect it anymore. They reached the county seat the following afternoon. It was a larger town than Delwood, with a proper courthouse and a land registry office that occupied the ground floor of a building on the main street. Colt had been there before. The clerk he usually dealt with, a thin man named Folger, was technically competent and personally unremarkable. Folger was not at his desk when they walked in. A younger clerk, barely 20, looked up from a pile of documents and then looked at them both again with the particular attention of someone deciding something. Help you? We're here to review deed filings, Colt said. Double M Ranch and a number of adjacent properties. Standard review. The young clerk's eyes moved to Evelyn and back to Colt. Mr. Folger handles most of the deed inquiries. When will he be back? Hard to say. He was already looking back at his papers. You could come back tomorrow. We rode 2 days to get here, Colt said. His voice didn't change pitch, but something in it changed. The filings are public record. I'd like to review them now. The young clerk looked at him again, longer this time, clearly calculating. Whatever he calculated came out in Colt's favor, because he stood up with visible reluctance and disappeared into the back room. Evelyn leaned close to Colt's shoulder. He's going to tell Folger we're here. I know. Folger is cooperative with them. I know that too. He kept his voice quiet. Let him tell whoever he needs to tell. We're reviewing public records. There's nothing they can do about that today. The young clerk came back with a ledger and 2 sets of filed documents and set them on the counter with the expression of a man doing something he didn't like and couldn't avoid. Colt thanked him without sarcasm, and they took the documents to a table near the window. What they found over the next 2 hours was not dramatic, from the outside. It was columns of numbers, property descriptions in legal language, deed transfer records with dates and signatures. But Evelyn moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had been reading documents like these for years. And Colt watched her work and understood, incrementally, what she was seeing. Here, she said quietly, turning a ledger toward him and pointing. This is the registered deed for the Paxton property. Look at the water rights clause. He read it. Then he read it again. The water rights aren't included in the property description. Right. But in the original filing, she pulled a document from the folder she'd brought with her, the copies she'd been accumulating. Here is Paxton's original deed, filed 12 years ago. Water rights are explicit. Coldwater Creek tributary access, listed clear as day. Colt looked between the 2 documents. Someone removed it from the registered version, or substituted a different version. She turned to another page in the ledger. Henderson. Same thing. The water rights on his 200 acres appear in the original deed and disappear in the current registered record. Without the water rights, the land isn't worth much. It's worth very little, she said, which means Northwest Range Holdings acquired those properties at a fair price for land without water, and what they actually hold is land with water rights that still legally exist in the original documents, but that no current buyer would know to look for. Colt sat back. They're stripping the water from the deeds before acquisition, and then selling the full package, land plus water, to the outside investors at the real value. Her voice was flat and technical, which he had come to understand was how she controlled it when she was angry. The original sellers don't know what they sold. The territorial clerks who alter the registered versions get paid for their cooperation. By the time anyone examines the chain of title, it's buried under enough transactions that it's very difficult to follow. But not impossible, he said. She met his eyes. Not impossible. They spent another hour making careful copies of the discrepant records. The young clerk watched them from behind his counter with the anxious energy of someone waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. They thanked him, took their copies, and walked out into the afternoon heat of the county seat's main street. Folger will have sent word by tonight, Evelyn said. To Crane? To someone who tells Crane. She held the documents against her side, one hand flat against them. They'll know we have these copies. Let them know. Colt put his hat back on. What we have now is enough to take to a territorial judge, not a county official. A territorial judge, someone above the local network. She was quiet for a moment. I tried that in New Mexico, she said. The judge there was, This isn't New Mexico, he said, not unkindly, but firmly. And you weren't walking in there with a Blackthorn Valley rancher and a deed comparison that shows the same alteration pattern across multiple properties in one season. She looked at him with that measuring expression. Then something in it shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting, recalculating. You'd have to make a formal complaint, she said. Your name on the record. I know. That makes you a target. I own 7,000 acres with water rights that are registered and locked down, he said. I'm already a target. The only question is whether I know it. He picked up his reins. Come on, I want to get back on the road before dark. They rode in silence for the first hour back down the eastern slope and onto the dry flats, the sun ahead of them now and dropping. The land had the emptied-out look of late afternoon, everything stark and clear in the long, low light. You should know, Evelyn said eventually, without preamble, that when we get back, people are going to talk about this, about us riding to the county seat together. People talked before we left, Colt said. That's what people do. I mean, they'll say I'm using you, that I got your attention, and now I'm pulling you into something for my own reasons. He looked over at her. She was watching the road ahead. Are you? She turned and met his eyes. My reason is stopping what happened to my family from happening to 30 other families in that valley. That's my reason. I know, he said. That's why I came. She turned back to the road. A long pause. Then quieter. Briggs has already been talking. Before the county seat trip. Someone told me he told Hargrove that I'd been bothering ranchers with wild stories about land fraud. Briggs is either in their pocket or he's afraid, Colt said. Either way, he's going to be the first voice people hear. He thought about this. The valley was a community in the way that small places always were, networked by years of shared history, mutual dependency, and the particular social arithmetic of people who needed each other for practical survival. His opinion carried weight in that community. He knew it, and he'd always been careful with it. But careful had its limits, and they were approaching one. Then we don't let him be the only voice, Colt said. When they rode back into Delwood 2 days later, the town looked the same as it always did. The feed store, the ironwood, the dust on the main street, the same faces moving between the same buildings in the same patterns. But Colt noticed things he hadn't sharpened his attention to before. Aldous Crane's associate, a heavy-set man who went by Wills and claimed to represent a surveying company, standing outside the hotel in conversation with Deputy Holt, the way the conversation ended when Colt rode past. The way Holt's eyes followed him for a moment before the deputy looked away. They were being watched. That was new, or newly visible. Dell met him at the Double M barn that evening with the expression of a man who had accumulated several things to say and was deciding the order. Finch came by yesterday, Dell said. Roy Finch. He's heard about the county seat trip. How? This valley has ears. Dell handed him a brush and they worked the horses side by side in the barn's quiet. He wants to talk to you, said it's about what he mentioned at the Ironwood. The land moving. Yeah, Dell paused. Also, Briggs came into town on Thursday and told Hargrove that you'd been taken in by a con woman who's been running the same story in 2 other territories. Colt's jaw tightened. Briggs said that. Hargrove's telling people, not aggressively. Hargrove doesn't do things aggressively. But he's saying it in the careful way he has, where by the end of the conversation you feel like you've reached the conclusion yourself. Colt put the brush down and looked at the wall for a moment. He'd known Hargrove for 11 years. They'd never been close, exactly, but he'd considered the man honest. That assessment was shifting. Set up a meeting with Roy Finch, he said. His place or mine, doesn't matter. And Briggs? Leave Briggs, Colt said. For now. He rode out to Evelyn's the next morning. He was making a habit of it, but the word didn't bother him anymore the way it had. And found her in the barn with a new horse, a difficult one, a black gelding that was rolling his eyes and shifting his weight with the anxious energy of an animal that had been mishandled. He stood at the barn door and watched her work for a few minutes before she acknowledged him. She had a particular way of going still in the middle of movement, not frozen, but quieted, brought down to the minimum, that the horses responded to. The black gelding was still nervous, but he was nervous near her rather than away from her, which was progress. Briggs is talking, Colt said when she turned toward him. I know. She came out of the stall and latched it behind her. He told Wheeler, my landlord, that I'd been making trouble and embarrassing the valley. Wheeler came by yesterday morning and told me he needs the lease payment in full by the end of the month, or he'll have to find another tenant. She said it without drama. I'm 2 months behind. I can cover 1 month, not 2. Colt looked at her. How much? Don't, she said, and her voice had a hard edge to it. I wasn't offering charity. I was asking the number so I understand the timeline. She held his gaze for a moment. $40. Wheeler's squeezing you on Briggs's say-so, Colt said. Briggs is either running interference for Crane or he's protecting himself from what we're going to expose. Either way, this is pressure. It's the same thing they did in New Mexico. Isolate, discredit, make it too expensive to keep fighting. I know what it is, she said. I recognize it. That doesn't make it less effective. He looked around the barn, the careful order of it, the tools hung neatly, the stalls clean, the work that was visible everywhere in the place. She'd built something here, small and financially fragile and working against a headwind of people who decided not to believe her, but built. Roy Finch wants to meet, he said. I think if we show him what we found at the county seat, he'll come with us. He's respected in this valley and he's worried already. We just need to give that worry a shape. Evelyn wiped her hands on her trousers. And if he doesn't believe it, then we figure out who will. He picked up his hat from the fence post. But Roy Finch is not a man who disbelieves documents. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light came through the barn door and lay across the straw floor in long planks. The black gelding moved in his stall and blew through his nose and went quiet. Why are you doing this? She said. Not suspiciously, genuinely asking. He thought about it because she deserved a real answer and not a quick one. Because this valley is worth protecting, he said. Because what you're describing is a machine that chews up people who built something real and spits out profit for people who built nothing. He paused. And because you've been right about it for 3 years and nobody helped you, which is a wrong that sits badly with me. She looked at the floor, then back up. I warned you to stay away from me, she said. You did. You didn't. No, he agreed. I didn't. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that she closed down before it arrived, out of long habit. She turned back toward the stall. Tell Roy Finch Thursday, she said. I'll come with the documents. He rode back toward the Double M, the ridge running solid along the northern horizon, and the valley laid out in the morning heat, dry and familiar, and underneath its familiar surface, something moving that most people couldn't see yet. He thought about Roy Finch's careful voice. He thought about Hargrove's quiet, deliberate words spreading through the community like water finding its level. He thought about Evelyn Hart, 3 years alone with documents nobody would look at, doing the math on a fraud that had already cost her everything once. By Thursday, he knew the valley would start to choose sides. Most people didn't do that consciously. They just gradually moved toward the version of events that cost them the least, and you couldn't always blame them for it. But the shape of things was forming, whether people acknowledged it or not. The question was whether the truth could move faster than the story being built around it. He wasn't certain, but he'd committed to finding out. Roy Finch's kitchen table was not large enough for what they spread across it on Thursday morning, but they made it work. Evelyn laid the documents out in 2 columns, original filings on the left, current registered versions on the right, and Roy sat across from her with his reading glasses on, and his coffee going cold and didn't say a word for almost 20 minutes. His brother Garrett stood against the wall with his arms folded and the expression of a man who wanted to dismiss what he was seeing and couldn't quite find the ground to do it from. Roy took his glasses off finally and set them on the table. How many properties, he said. 6 confirmed, Evelyn said. Paxton, Henderson, the Birch Creek parcel that sold in June, 2 smaller homesteads on the South Ridge, and a grazing lease on the East Flat that transferred in April. She paused. There are likely more I haven't been able to document yet. These are the ones where I have both versions of the deed. Roy looked at Colt. You believe this? I looked at the documents myself, Colt said. The water rights don't disappear by accident. That's a deliberate alteration made after original filing. Roy turned his glasses over in his hands. It was a thinking gesture. Colt had seen it before in other conversations when Roy was doing the kind of arithmetic that had real consequences. If they pull the water rights out of the registered deeds, he said slowly, and then sell to outside investors with the water rights intact, the outside investors get legal title to water that the Valley ranchers believe they still own, Evelyn said. When the conflict surfaces, and it will, the paper trail favors the investors. The original deeds are buried under multiple transactions by then. That's how they did it in New Mexico, Colt said. Roy looked at her. That's where you're from. My family lost everything to this same operation 4 years ago, she said. She said it plainly, no performance in it. Different company name, same structure, same result. Garrett pushed off the wall. And you've been sitting on this for 2 years without telling anyone. I told Deputy Holt, she said. I told Hargrove. I told 3 ranchers who were receptive enough to listen and then decided it was safer to doubt me. She met Garrett's eyes without flinching. People don't want to believe something like this is happening in their valley. It's easier to decide the person telling them is the problem. Garrett didn't have a quick answer for that. He looked at his brother. Roy set his glasses down flat on the table. Aldous Crane, he said. I've seen him in town. Didn't like the look of him, but that's not evidence. He looked at the documents again. The clerk who altered these records. Do you know who it is? A man named Drummond, Evelyn said. He processes deed amendments. His signature appears on both the Henderson and Paxton alterations. I have a copy of a letter from New Mexico, correspondence between Drummond and a land company affiliate there, before he moved to this territory. Roy stared at her. You have a letter. I've been collecting for 3 years, she said. Garrett made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Lord. So, Roy looked at Colt. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we take this to Judge Harlan in the territorial capital, Colt said. Not Delwood, not the county seat. Territorial level, above the local network. We present the deed discrepancies, the Drummond correspondence, and the pattern across multiple properties. We file a formal complaint and request an injunction on further transfers pending investigation. That'll take time, Roy said. It will. But there's an auction scheduled. Colt paused. Crane's man Wills has been talking to people about it for 2 weeks. A consolidated land auction in Delwood, end of next month. They're going to try to move the remaining properties they've been positioning in a single transaction. If we can get an injunction before that auction, we stop it, Roy said. We stop it, and we do it with territorial authority behind us, which means they can't just apply local pressure and make it disappear. Roy was quiet. The kitchen had the particular silence of a place where a decision was being made, and everyone in the room could feel the weight of it. I'll sign the complaint, Roy said. Get my name on it. Garrett? Garrett looked at the documents on the table for a long moment. He was not as careful as his brother, which sometimes made him slower to commit and sometimes made him faster. Yeah, he said. Put my name on it too. Evelyn looked down at the table. She didn't say thank you. Colt had noticed she didn't say it easily, which he took to mean it came from somewhere real when she did say it. But something in her posture changed slightly, the way a person's does when they've been carrying something alone for a long time and someone else puts a hand to it. They rode back to Delwood that afternoon with the Finch brothers' signatures on a letter of support and the documented evidence packed carefully in Evelyn's saddlebag. It should have felt like progress. It did feel like progress. But Colt had lived long enough to know that progress had a way of alerting the thing you were progressing against. He found out how fast that worked the following morning. Dell was waiting for him at the barn with the look he got when news was bad and time-sensitive. Someone went through the tack room last night, he said. Back window was forced. Nothing taken, far as I can tell, but everything was gone through. The file box you keep in there. Colt was already moving toward the tack room. The file box, an iron-clasped document box where he kept land records and correspondence, was open on the workbench, its contents scattered. He went through it piece by piece. His personal deed documents were intact. The water rights registration was there. The copies he'd made at the county seat were gone. He stood in the tack room for a moment with his hands flat on the workbench and breathed through the anger, which was cleaner and more useful that way. They know we have the originals, Dell said from the doorway. They can't take the originals. Colt straightened. Evelyn has those at her property. He paused. I need to get to her place. Colt. Dell's voice had a particular quality. There's something else. Wills was at the Ironwood last night, talking to several people. I heard from Kurt, he tends bar, that Wills told people you'd been making threats. That you'd threatened to use your water rights position to undermine neighboring properties if ranchers didn't side with you against legitimate business interests. Colt looked at him. He said you were trying to consolidate the valley under your own control, Dell said. That the woman, Evelyn Hart, was working with you as some kind of scheme, that the land fraud story was a cover for your own acquisition play. The precision of it was almost admirable. Take the truth and invert it, then distribute the inversion at the Ironwood on a Thursday night when people were drinking and not at their most skeptical. By morning, it would be in 6 conversations. By the end of the week, it would feel like something people had always suspected. Who was in the room? Colt said. Mix. Hargrove was there. Briggs. 4 or 5 smaller ranchers. A couple of the hired hands from East End Properties. Hargrove. Colt turned that over. The store owner who sat on the town council and said things in the careful way that made people feel like they'd thought of it themselves. He rode hard to Evelyn's property and found her at the corral. Before he was fully off his horse, she said, "I know, someone came here last night too." He stopped. "What happened?" "I heard them around 2 a.m, a horse outside, then footsteps near the barn." She was controlled, but her jaw was tight. "I came out with a rifle and they were gone before I could see a face. This morning I found the back window of my house had been tried. The latch is damaged. They didn't get in." "The documents." "Safe." She tapped the side of her coat. "I don't keep them in the house. They're in a waterproof wrap in the floor of the second stall. I put them there the night we got back from the county seat." He let out a breath. "You expected this." "I've been through it before." She looked at him levelly. "They tried the same thing in New Mexico. Break in, take the copies, create doubt about the original evidence. It only works if we don't have the originals." She paused. "Are yours gone?" "The copies from the county seat, yes." "Then they know what we have, but not how much." She folded her arms. "We need to move faster than we planned." He leaned against the fence. "Wills spent last night at the Ironwood turning my reputation around. By now, Hargrove's told half the town I'm running some kind of consolidation scheme." She watched him carefully. "Does that change anything for you?" It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. She was asking whether the cost had become too high. He recognized what it cost her to ask it. She'd been let down before by people who'd decided it wasn't their problem, and asking again was an act of particular courage from someone who didn't have much reason to trust the answer. "No," he said. "It changes the timeline, that's all." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "Then we do it this week. I'll write the formal complaint tonight. You and the Finch brothers sign tomorrow. We ride for the territorial capital the day after." 4 days to Judge Harlan, he said. 3 if we push. He nodded. They stood in the dry morning with the mountain at their backs and the valley spread out below them, and Colt thought about the Ironwood and Hargrove and the careful, patient machinery of discrediting people who told inconvenient truths. It wasn't loud, that machinery. It didn't announce itself. It just worked, quietly and consistently, until the person it was working against found themselves standing alone, and the people who might have believed them had gradually moved to safer ground. He was not going to stand alone. But he was beginning to understand the price of that. It came due faster than he expected. 2 days before they were set to leave for the territorial capital, Colt rode into Dellwood for feed and found 3 ranchers from the south end of the valley waiting in front of the feed store with the uncomfortable posture of a delegation that hadn't entirely agreed on what it was doing there. Their spokesman, a man named Cresswell, who ran a modest cattle operation and had always been cordial, took his hat off when Colt dismounted. "Colt," he said, "we need to have a word." "Go ahead," Colt said. Cresswell glanced at the other 2. "There's talk going around about the county seat trip, about what you've been doing with the Hart woman." "I know what's going around," Colt said. "I know who started it." "That may be," Cresswell said carefully. "But the thing is, Crane's people have been talking to us, directly. They're offering fair prices, Colt. Better than fair for some of us. And if there's going to be an auction, some of us are thinking maybe..." "You're thinking about selling." "I'm thinking about my family's security." Cresswell's voice had a thin, defensive edge to it, the sound of a man who knows he's doing something he'll feel bad about and is building the justification in real time. "If the water rights situation is what they say it is..." "The water rights situation is a fraud," Colt said. "The documents proving that are 4 inches thick. If you sell to Northwest Range Holdings, you will sell your water rights without knowing it. When you find that out, there will be nothing you can do about it." Cresswell looked at him. "That's what you say. That's what the deed records say." Colt looked at all 3 of them. "Come to the Finch place tomorrow morning. Bring any other ranchers who'll listen. Look at the documents yourselves. You don't have to take my word for it." A silence. The street dust moved in the light wind. Somewhere down the block, a door banged shut. "Hargrove says..." One of the other men started. "I know what Hargrove says," Colt said. "Hargrove says it in a room with whiskey and without documents." He put his hat back on. "Tomorrow morning, Roy Finch's place. Come or don't come." He went into the feed store and bought what he needed and didn't look back at the three men on the street, but he felt the weight of that conversation for the rest of the day. Cresswell wasn't a bad man. None of the three of them were bad men. They were frightened men in a dry year with families to feed, and frightened people moved toward the thing that felt most like safety, even when it was the thing most likely to hurt them. He couldn't fully blame them for it, but he wasn't going to watch them walk into it without trying. That evening, sitting on the porch of the Double M in the cooling dark, Dell came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair, and for a while neither of them said anything. 7 ranchers have been approached by Crane's people with offers, Dell said eventually. I've been keeping count. How many are considering it? 3 definite, 2 on the fence. Dell turned his cup. Cresswell, like you know. Hartley on the South Ridge. And old Pemberton, the father, not the son. Colt looked at the dark ridge against the sky. Pemberton Sr. had been in this valley for 30 years. He'd built his operation from dirt-poor beginnings, and he was 71 years old, and the dry summer had hit him harder than most because he'd been declining for 2 years without letting his sons manage the business end properly. Pemberton, Colt said, he doesn't know what he'd be signing away. Probably not. Colt set down his coffee. I'll go see him tomorrow, before Finch's. Dell was quiet for a moment. You know what this looks like, he said. Not accusing, just noting. You running around warning people off the sale. The story Wills is telling is that you're trying to keep competing buyers out. I know what it looks like. Some people are going to choose the easier story. Some people always do, Colt said. That's not a reason to stop telling the true one. Dell nodded once, slowly. They sat in the dark a while longer, and somewhere out in the pasture a cow was complaining about something, and the stars were doing what they always did out here, coming out hard and deliberate, crowding the sky, indifferent to everything happening underneath them. He thought about Evelyn Hart writing the formal complaint by lamplight in her spare house with the tin cup of dried flowers on the sill, and 3 years of accumulated evidence packed in the floor of a horse stall. Doing it methodically, without anyone having asked her to, because it was the thing that needed doing and nobody else was going to do it. He went to bed with the particular restlessness of a man who knows the next several days are going to determine something he can't take back. Old Pemberton answered the door in the morning with the cautious look of a man who'd already had one unexpected visitor that week. Colt took his hat off at the door, which was the kind of gesture the old rancher would notice. Colt Mercer, Pemberton said. Come in, then. The house smelled like old wood and coffee and the particular smell of a place where someone lives alone and has stopped noticing things. Pemberton moved slowly to the kitchen and poured 2 cups and sat across the table with the careful deliberateness of a man whose bones hurt. I heard you've been talking to Crane's people, Colt said. They came to me, Pemberton said. I didn't go looking. I know. I'm not criticizing. Colt set his hat on the table. I want to show you something before you decide anything. He put the documents on the table. Not all of them. Just the Paxton comparison. The 2 versions of a deed side by side, the water rights appearing in one and absent in the other. He let Pemberton read without talking. The old man read slowly. His hands spread flat on the table were the hands of someone who had worked land for 50 years, thick across the palm, scarred at the knuckles. He turned the pages carefully. He sat back. They took Paxton's water, he said. Out of the registered record, Colt said. After Paxton signed. Paxton doesn't know. Pemberton looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Colt. My deed, he said. I don't have your deed in this set, Colt said. But if the pattern holds and you sign with Northwest Range Holdings, I'd be signing away the creek rights. Without knowing it, yes. The kitchen was very quiet. A fly moved across the window. Pemberton's hand stayed flat on the documents for a long moment. My sons are going to say I should have let them handle the business, the old man said quietly. Maybe, Colt said. But you didn't know. Nobody in this valley knew, because somebody worked very hard to make sure they didn't. Pemberton nodded slowly. The nod of a man absorbing something that shifted the shape of a decision he'd almost made. I'll come to Finch's this morning, he said. When Colt rode up to Roy Finch's property 2 hours later, there were 7 horses already tied outside. By the time Evelyn arrived with the full document set and spread it on Roy's kitchen table for the second time that week, there were 11 people in the room. Not all of them believed it. 2 left early. One man, Briggs's neighbor, a rancher named Caswell, sat through the entire presentation with his arms folded and his face closed and said nothing, and Colt couldn't tell which way he'd land. But old Pemberton sat in the corner, and when Evelyn explained the water rights alteration a second time, he turned to the man beside him and said, in the flat, unambiguous tone of someone who had stopped being a fence-sitter, "She's right. I nearly signed last week." That sentence did more than an hour of documents. Colt watched it move through the room. The slight shift in posture, the exchange of glances, the particular moment when a group of people goes from skeptical to unsettled to something closer to angry. It was not a complete conversion. Some of them would go home and doubt it again by morning. But the ground had moved, and that was real. Evelyn stood at the end of Roy's kitchen table with her papers and her careful, controlled voice and 3 years of patience coming to a point, and Colt thought, she has been right about every single part of this, and she did it alone, and the Valley is only now beginning to understand what it almost lost. They left for the territorial capital the next morning, before dawn, while the stars were still out and Delwood was quiet. Neither of them knew that by the time they returned, the sabotage would have already started. They were 3 hours out of the territorial capital when Colt's horse threw a shoe. It happened on the downgrade past the pine line, the horse stepping wrong on a loose piece of shale and the left front shoe pulling clean. Not dangerous, the horse wasn't hurt, but it meant stopping, finding a farrier, losing most of an afternoon in a small supply town called Red Hook that had one street and a blacksmith who worked at his own pace and didn't alter it for anyone. Colt stood outside the blacksmith's and watched the light change while Evelyn sat on a fence rail across the road with the saddlebag on her lap and the look of someone doing the arithmetic on time they didn't have. "We lose today," he said. "I know. We still get to Harlan by tomorrow noon." "I know that too." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the road back the way they'd come, and there was something in her face that he'd learned to read over the past weeks. The particular tension she carried when she was thinking about what might be happening while she wasn't there to stop it. "Whatever they're doing back there," he said, "we can't ride to stop it and reach Harlan at the same time." "I know," she said, for the 3rd time. Then, "I just keep thinking about Pemberton. He's 71 years old and he nearly signed last week. If someone goes to him today with the right words and the right pressure, Roy Finch will watch for it," Colt said. "I asked him before we left." She looked at him. He hadn't told her that. "You asked him," she said. "I asked him to keep an eye on Pemberton and Cresswell, and to send word to Dell if Crane's people made any direct moves." He leaned against the fence beside her. "We can't do everything from 2 territories away, but we set up what we could." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're better at this than I expected." "At what?" "Planning around people, thinking about who needs watching and who can be trusted to do it." She looked back at the road. "I've been working alone for so long I forgot that's how it's supposed to work." He didn't say anything to that, but it sat with him. They reached the territorial capital by the following noon as planned, and Judge Harlan's office was in the stone courthouse at the top of the main street, a building that had the solid, unornamented look of something built to outlast the people using it. His clerk, a composed woman of about 50, told them the judge was in session until 3 and could see them at past. They waited on a bench in the hallway and didn't talk much. Evelyn organized the documents again, which she'd already organized twice on the road. He understood it, not nervousness exactly, more the behavior of a person who needed their hands doing something to keep the rest of them still. Judge Harlan was not what Colt had pictured. He'd expected someone formal and distant, the kind of man who communicated through procedure. Instead, Harlan was compact and gray-haired with a direct way of looking at people that suggested he'd heard a great many things in this room and had developed reliable instincts about which of them were worth his time. He listened without interrupting. Evelyn laid the documents out on his desk in the order she'd established. Original deeds, altered registered versions, the Drummond correspondence, the pattern across 6 properties, the New Mexico precedent. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, just the evidence and what it showed. When she finished, Harlan sat back and looked at the documents without touching them. "Northwest Range Holdings," he said. "I've heard that name." "In what connection?" Colt asked. A complaint from a different territory 2 years ago. Nothing came of it. The complainant withdrew. He looked at Evelyn when he said it. That was you. No, she said. That was my attempt in Wyoming. I didn't withdraw it. It was dismissed on procedural grounds after 3 months of delays. Harlan looked at her steadily. The clerk Drummond. He's operating in my jurisdiction. Yes. Harlan picked up the Drummond correspondence and read it again, slowly, in the way of someone reading something a second time, to be sure of what they saw the first time. He set it down. The auction is scheduled for the end of the month, he said. 4 weeks, Evelyn said. I can issue a temporary injunction on property transfers involving Northwest Range Holdings and affiliated entities within Blackthorn Valley pending a formal investigation. He said it in the tone of someone thinking out loud, testing the structure of it. That stops the auction. It also, and you should understand this, immediately alerts the principals that someone with territorial authority is involved. They already know we came to you, Colt said. They've been watching us. Harlan looked at him. Then the question of surprise is already off the table. Yes. Harlan tapped the Drummond correspondence once with a finger. I'll need this original, and affidavits from the ranchers whose deeds were altered, Paxton, Henderson, and the others. Signed, witnessed, filed within 2 weeks. We can get those, Colt said. You understand that an injunction is not a conviction, Harlan said. It buys time and it forces a formal proceeding. But if the principals decide to fight it, and they will, it becomes a legal matter that moves at legal speed. I understand that, Evelyn said. I've watched it move at legal speed before. There was something in her voice, not bitterness exactly, but the dryness of a person who has learned not to confuse beginning something with finishing it. What I need is for it to begin with someone who can't be dismissed or quietly pressured at the county level. Harlan looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone revising a prior assessment. Leave the documents, he said. My clerk will prepare the injunction this afternoon. You'll have it in the morning. They walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun, and Evelyn stopped on the top step and put one hand on the stone railing and just stood there for a moment. Not dramatically. She wasn't a dramatic person. Just stood. Colt waited. 3 years, she said quietly. I've been trying to get someone with actual authority to look at this for 3 years. He looked, Colt said. He looked. She straightened. Some of the permanent tension in her shoulders was different. Not gone, but redistributed. Now we have to get home before they finish burning everything down. That last word turned out to be less metaphorical than either of them intended. They rode back hard, pushing the horses through the second day until the ridge appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon and the valley opened up below them in the long evening light. They were still 3 miles from Delwood when they saw the smoke. It was coming from the north end of the valley, a dark column rising straight in the still air. Colt pulled up and looked at it and felt the specific cold clarity that comes when something you feared becomes something real. That's the Finch property, he said. He didn't wait. He pushed his horse into a full run, and Evelyn was right beside him. It was not the house. They saw that from half a mile out, and something in him unnodded slightly. It was a barn on the eastern edge of Roy Finch's property, fully involved, burning with the particular thoroughness of a fire that had been started with help. Roy and 2 hands were on the water line, buckets and a hand pump from the well, doing what they could, which was mostly keeping the fire from spreading to the adjacent structure. Garrett was standing at the fence watching it with the fixed expression of a man who has already understood that the barn is gone and is working out what that means. Colt dismounted and came to him. Anyone hurt? No. Garrett's jaw was tight. Roy got the horses out. We lost 2 months of stored feed and the equipment that was in there. He paused. It was set. Southeast corner, you can see where it started. Oil, probably. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Colt looked at the fire. When? Last night. We were in the house. Didn't see anyone. Roy came over from the water line, his face streaked and his shirt dark with sweat and water. He looked at Colt without preamble. How'd it go? We have the injunction, Colt said. Signed this morning. Something moved across Roy's face, relief and anger in roughly equal parts. Good. He looked at the fire. They knew you were getting close to something. This is a warning. Or a punishment, Garrett said, for signing your name. Roy wiped his face with the back of his hand. Same thing. Evelyn had dismounted and was standing back from the group, looking at the burning barn with an expression that Colt recognized. She'd seen this kind of thing before. The escalation. The point where the people running the scheme decided that destruction was cheaper than delay. "They'll do more," she said. She said it to the group, not just to Colt. In New Mexico, after my father filed his first appeal, 3 of the ranchers who supported him had their water channels blocked inside a week. One had cattle cut loose. They'll do whatever it takes to make people feel like supporting this fight is too expensive. Roy looked at her directly. The first time he'd done that since Colt had introduced them, fully and without reservation. "What do we do?" he said. She met his eyes. "We get the affidavits signed and filed before the end of the week. All 6 property owners. We don't give them time to work on people's fear." She paused. "And we need to get the word out to the valley before Crane's people do. Not just the ranchers who came to your kitchen. Everyone." "Town meeting," Colt said. "Town meeting," she confirmed. Roy nodded. He looked at his burning barn one more time, the look of a man taking the cost into account and deciding the account is still worth it. And then he turned away from it. "I'll send word tonight. Delwood, day after tomorrow, evening. Hargrove can't stop a town meeting." "Hargrove will try to run it," Garrett said. "Let him try," Roy said. Colt rode to the Double M that night with Evelyn alongside him and the smell of smoke still in the air and the injunction folded in his coat pocket. Del met him at the gate with a lamp and the expression of a man who had been awake later than usual. "Finch's barn," Del said. "I know. I was there. There's more." Del fell into step beside them. "Henderson's water channel. Someone blocked it with rocks and debris 2 days ago. Henderson found it this morning. It's not catastrophic. They can clear it, but it took most of the day." He paused. "And Cresswell came by this afternoon looking for you." "What did he want?" "He wouldn't say to me, but he looked like a man who's been visited by someone he didn't want to see." Del looked at Colt. "I think Crane's people went to him again with a different kind of offer." Colt tied his horse and stood in the dark yard for a moment. The Double M was quiet around him. The cattle sounds from the far pasture, the horses in the barn, the ordinary night sounds of a working ranch. He thought about Cresswell, who was not a bad man but who had a wife and 3 children and a dry year to survive. "I'll go to him in the morning," Colt said. He did. Cresswell answered the door with the guilty look of a man who had already made a decision he wasn't sure about and was relieved and uncomfortable in equal measure to see Colt on his porch. "They came back," Colt said. Not a question. Cresswell stepped outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. "Yesterday afternoon. Wills and another man I didn't know." He looked at the ground. They said the injunction you got was going to tie up land transfers for years, and that any rancher who signed an affidavit would be named in counter litigation, that it could take everything." "That's not true," Colt said. "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't." Colt kept his voice even. "Harlan's injunction stops Northwest Range Holdings from transferring property. It doesn't expose the ranchers who file affidavits to litigation. The affidavits are statements of fact about their own property records. They're protected." He paused. "Wills told you a lie designed to make you afraid to sign." Cresswell was quiet for a moment. He looked like a man doing the math on his own fear and not feeling good about the total. "There's a town meeting day after tomorrow," Colt said. "Come, bring your wife if you want. She should hear it, and then decide." Cresswell looked up. "You're not angry?" "No," Colt said. And he wasn't, really. He was tired, and he was clear-eyed about what they were up against. And somewhere underneath both of those things, he was thinking about Evelyn Hart at the county seat, finding the second discrepancy with her finger on the line and the focused stillness of her face. "I'll come," Cresswell said. The town meeting was in the Delwood Community Hall, a long wooden building that smelled like sawdust and old lamp oil, and the particular weight of every difficult conversation the valley had ever held in it. By the time the evening started, there were more than 60 people inside. Colt had not expected 60. Hargrove arrived early and positioned himself at the front of the room with the confidence of a man who expected to moderate. Roy Finch positioned himself beside him with the confidence of a man who had other plans. The tension between the two of them was visible from the back of the room. Evelyn stood at the side wall, not at the front, with her documents in her hands and the expression of someone who had done this before and knew it could go any direction. Hargrove opened by expressing concern about rumors and misinformation and the damage that unfounded accusations could do to the community's relationship with legitimate business interests. He said it smoothly, in the careful way he always said things, and Colt watched people nodding and felt the familiar frustration of watching a skilled man lay groundwork. Then Roy Finch said, "I'd like Evelyn Hart to speak." The murmur in the room was not hostile exactly, but it was present. She walked to the front of the room and put the documents on the table, and she didn't apologize for being there. She didn't ease into it or explain herself. She pointed at the first document and said, "This is what your deed looks like when you sign it, and this is what it looks like in the registered record after Northwest Range Holdings processes the transfer." She put both versions side by side on the table and pointed to where the water rights language appeared in one and was absent in the other. "Henderson," she said. "Paxton, the Birch Creek parcel, 6 properties so far, same alteration on everyone." She looked up at the room. "When you sell to them, you sell your water. You just don't know it." The room was quiet in the particular way of 60 people absorbing something simultaneously. Then old Pemberton, from his chair near the back, said in his clear, caring voice, "She showed me my deed last week. I was 2 days from signing. I didn't know." That sentence moved through the room the same way it had moved through Roy Finch's kitchen, but larger now, with 60 people to ripple through instead of 11. Hargrove began to say something. Colt stepped forward. "Hargrove." He said it once, quietly, and something in the way he said it made the older man stop. "You've been in 6 conversations in the past 2 weeks telling people this woman was running a con. I'd like to know what you know about Northwest Range Holdings that makes you so certain she's wrong." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it, harder. Hargrove looked at Colt. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the 60 people looking at him. "I only know what I was told," he said finally. "By whom?" Roy Finch said. Hargrove didn't answer. And the not answering was itself an answer. Colt turned back to the room. "We have a territorial injunction stopping the auction. We need affidavits from the affected property owners filed within 2 weeks. If you've received an offer from Northwest Range Holdings or any affiliated company, I need to know. Tonight." 14 people raised their hands. Colt looked at that number for a moment. 14 families who had been within reach of losing their water and hadn't known it. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the hands, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was controlling something. But underneath the control, for just a moment, something else was visible. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. The look of a person who has been telling the truth for a long time and is finally standing in a room where it's being heard. Crane's response came the next morning. Colt was at the Double M having coffee before dawn when Dell knocked and came in without waiting, which he only did when something was wrong. "2 men with rifles at the south gate," Dell said. "They're not doing anything, just standing there." Colt put down his coffee. "How long?" 30 minutes. I saw them when I went to check the cattle." He went to the south gate and they were there, as Dell had said. 2 men on horseback at the gate, rifles in scabbards, making no move but making no secret of themselves either. One of them was the man who accompanied Wills. The other he didn't know. He stopped 20 feet from the gate. "You're on my land," he said. "Gate's the property line," the one he didn't know said. His voice was flat and professional. "We're on the road." "What do you want?" "Mr. Crane wants to offer you a conversation." The man reached into his coat and produced an envelope and held it out. "Private, tomorrow morning. He says he has a proposal that might simplify things considerably." Colt looked at the envelope. He looked at the 2 men. The rifles in the scabbards weren't a threat exactly, not yet, but they were a language, and the language was clear enough. He took the envelope. "I'll read it," he said. He went back inside and opened it at the kitchen table while Dell stood in the doorway. The letter was brief, handwritten in a neat, controlled hand, and it offered Colt a significant sum, a number that made Dell, reading over his shoulder, let out a quiet breath, for his water rights on the Coldwater Creek tributary. It framed it as a partnership opportunity. It did not mention the injunction. It did not mention Evelyn Hart. But both of those omissions were themselves a message, and the message was, "We know what you're doing, and we're offering you a way out of it before this gets worse." Colt set the letter down. "What are you going to do?" Dell said. Colt picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. "I'm going to ride to Evelyn's," he said, "and then I'm going to go see Paxton and Henderson and get those affidavits signed before the end of the day." Dell looked at him. "You're not going to the meeting." "No," Colt said. "I'm not going to the meeting." He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket, not because he intended to keep it, but because it was evidence, and everything was evidence now. Outside, the two men at the gate were still there when he rode past them on the way north, and he didn't look at them, and the morning was already hot, and the valley was dry, and the ridge stood against the sky the way it always had, unchanged, as if none of this was happening against its feet. But it was happening, and the next 2 weeks would decide whether the valley held or broke. The affidavits took 4 days to collect, not 2 weeks. Colt and Evelyn split the work. He rode to Paxton and Henderson and the two smaller homesteaders on the South Ridge. She went to the Birch Creek property and tracked down the owner of the East Flat grazing lease, a quiet man named Orell, who had already half convinced himself to drop out of the whole thing after Wills had paid him a visit, and left him shaken. She sat at Orell's kitchen table for an hour and showed him the documents and answered his questions without pushing. And he signed at the end of it with the deliberate, slightly grim look of a man choosing a harder path over an easier one. 6 affidavits. Signed, witnessed, bundled with the deed comparisons and the Drummond correspondence and sent to Judge Harlan by courier on a Thursday morning. The following Tuesday, 2 territorial marshals arrived in Delwood. They came quietly. No announcement, no drama. And went first to the county clerk's office, where they spent 3 hours with the records, and then to the hotel where Aldous Crane had been staying under the name A. Cranston, which was not a particularly creative alias, and which Evelyn noted with the particular flat expression of someone who had been underestimated by smarter people than this. Crane was not in his room. He had left the previous evening, according to the hotel proprietor, with 2 bags and no stated destination. Wills had also gone, along with the 2 men who had sat at Colt's south gate. The operation had a practiced quality to its disappearance. No papers left behind, no forwarding address, the kind of clean exit that spoke to experience with this exact moment and this exact type of situation. The marshals found Drummond at the county clerk's office, sitting at his desk, and he did not run. He sat and looked at the documents they put in front of him with the particular stillness of a man who has known for some time that a specific morning was coming and has spent that time making a kind of internal peace with it. He signed a full statement before noon. The statement named Crane by his real name, Aldous Creighton, originally of Ohio, and 2 other principals, and confirmed the alteration process on 11 properties across 3 territories over 6 years, not just the 6 they had documented. 11 properties. Colt learned that number standing in Roy Finch's yard on a Wednesday afternoon from a marshal named Tate, who delivered information with the economical precision of someone trained not to add commentary to facts. 11, Roy said after Tate had gone. 11, Colt confirmed. Roy looked at his rebuilt fence line. The old barn was already partially framed, new lumber pale against the dry summer ground. "We almost didn't catch it at all," he said. "No," Colt agreed. "We almost didn't." Roy was quiet for a moment, then, "She knew about all 11? "She knew about at least 9, Colt said. She'd been tracking the pattern for 3 years. Roy Finch was not a man who showed what he felt without deciding to show it. He stood there and looked at the new fence lumber for a long moment. "I should have listened to her 2 years ago," he said. "You didn't know her 2 years ago. She tried to tell people," Roy said. "Not just us, others. And nobody listened." He picked up a nail from the fence post and turned it in his fingers. "That's worth sitting with, I think." It was. Colt had been sitting with it since the night of the town meeting, watching Evelyn stand at that table and show her documents to 60 people who were finally ready to see them after years of the same woman, the same documents, the same truth being turned away at various doors. There was something in that which didn't resolve cleanly. Something that stayed uncomfortable the way a real thing stays uncomfortable, because the valley's near miss wasn't just about the fraud. It was about how easily a community decides that a woman without land or family connections or local history isn't a credible source of information about the thing that's about to destroy them. Crane and his people had understood that and used it, and they'd nearly been right. The legal proceeding took the shape that Harlan had warned them it would. Slow, technical, grinding through the machinery of territorial law with no particular regard for how urgently the people involved needed resolution. Drummond's testimony was the cornerstone. The deed alterations were the structure. It would take most of a year to fully adjudicate, Harlan's office told them, and some of the property transfers would require separate civil proceedings to unwind. But the auction didn't happen. That was the immediate, concrete reality. The injunction held, Crane was gone, and the 14 families who had been approached with offers were no longer in the path of a machine they hadn't known was coming. Hargrove left Dellwood in September. He didn't announce it. He sold the store to a man from out east who arrived with his family and repainted the front of the building and was generally considered a fair dealer. Hargrove's departure was discussed briefly and then mostly let go, the way communities let go of uncomfortable things when the alternative is having to examine their own role in them. Colt didn't push it. Some things were better left to work themselves out. Briggs stayed. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, been directly involved in the fraud. He'd been useful to it through his willingness to discredit Evelyn, but whether he'd been paid for that or had simply done it out of self-interest and poor character was never fully established. He stayed, and he was quieter than he'd been before. And when he passed Evelyn on the street in Dellwood in October, he looked at the ground. She didn't stop walking. She had more interesting things to do than manage Briggs's guilt for him. Wheeler, her landlord, came to her in August, sheepish in the way of a man who knows he behaved badly and is working up to something. He reduced her lease payment to a rate that was reasonable, not charitable, which was what she wanted. She paid 3 months in advance. She had 2 new training clients by then, ranchers who'd come to her after the town meeting with the slightly abashed manner of people who'd been slow to appreciate something that was now obviously worth appreciating. She hired a hand, a young man named Voss who was good with horses and didn't ask too many questions, and expanded the training corral. It wasn't prosperity, but it was footing. Colt's role in the whole affair acquired a particular quality in the Valley's retelling of it that he was not entirely comfortable with. The story, as it settled into the community's memory, had a shape that centered him more than was accurate. The rancher who stood up, who risked his reputation, who organized the resistance. He understood why stories took that shape. A community needed a figure to organize its own courage around, and Colt was the figure with the land and the name and the established credibility. It was easier than acknowledging that a woman with a leased property and a troubled past had been right for 3 years and had been ignored until someone with more social capital stood beside her. He said that once to Dell, not publicly, but plainly. Dell turned it over for a moment. "So what do you do with that?" "I don't know," Colt said. "I keep saying it accurately when people tell the story wrong, I suppose. That'll make you unpopular at the Ironwood." "I've survived that before." Dell almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, "you have." The day Colt told Evelyn what he needed to tell her, it was October, and the dry summer had finally broken in September with 2 weeks of rain that left the valley green and changed in the way things are changed when they've been starved for something and finally get it. The creek beds were running again. The grass had come back. The cattle were looking better. He rode out to her property on a morning that was cool enough for a jacket, and she was in the corral with a new horse, another difficult one, a roan with trust issues. And she saw him coming and finished what she was doing before she came to the fence. "The Drummond testimony cleared Henderson's water rights officially," he said. "Harlan's office confirmed it yesterday." "I heard," she said. "Roy sent word. Paxton, too. His appeal goes automatically." "Good." She leaned on the fence rail. She looked different than she had in August. Not happier exactly, but less pressurized. Like a person who has put down something very heavy and is still figuring out what their hands are supposed to do now. He held his reins in both hands and was quiet for a moment. He was not typically a man who had difficulty saying what he meant. He found that this was harder. "I've been thinking about what this valley is going to look like in 10 years, he said. "The double M is solid. I've got water, I've got land, I've got the operation running right, and I've been—" He paused. "I've been doing it alone for a long time, which was fine when that was what made sense." She was watching him, not making it easier, just watching. "I'm not asking you to need something from me," he said. "I know that's not how you're built, and I'm not interested in changing it." He looked at her directly. "I'm asking if you want a partner, in the actual sense of the word. Equal ground, equal say. Your operation and mine, if that's what you want, or something built together if that's something else. The roan horse moved behind her in the corral, and she didn't take her eyes off Colt. You remember what I said to you at the gathering? She said. I remember every word of it. I told you to stay away from me. You told me it wasn't a good time, he said. I think your time might be better now. Something moved across her face. The same thing he'd seen at Roy Finch's table the night of the town meeting. That controlled expression with something else underneath it, something that had been waiting a long time to have room. I'm not easy to be around, she said. I think about things longer than most people. I don't forget things I should probably let go. I'm behind on 3 small repairs on this property, and I keep putting them off because I'd rather be in the corral. She paused. I'm not a woman who makes a comfortable life for someone else. I didn't ask for comfortable, Colt said. I asked for a partner. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the roan horse came over and pushed his nose against her shoulder, and she put a hand up to him without looking, the automatic gesture of someone whose attention is elsewhere. All right, she said finally. It was not a romantic word. It was not a declaration. It was the word of a person who had thought the thing through to the end and found it sound. He liked it better for that. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence, and they stood in the cool October morning and talked about practical things. The lease, the operation, the corral expansion, what combining resources would look like. And it was the most honest conversation about the future he'd had in years, which was either unusual or was simply what happened when you found someone whose instinct was to say the true thing rather than the easy one. There were things that didn't get fixed by the end of that year. The Valley's habit of believing the well-established over the accurate was not cured by one near miss. Communities don't work that way, and anyone who thought a single crisis teaches permanent lessons was misreading human nature. Hargrove was gone, but the tendency Hargrove had embodied, the willingness to distribute convenient doubt about inconvenient people, didn't leave with him. It lived in quieter forms in other places, and Colt and Evelyn both understood that. Drummond served 2 years in the territorial prison and was released and was not heard from in that valley again. Crane, Aldous Creighton of Ohio, was located 18 months later in Colorado, where he had begun a similar operation under a different company name, and was arrested and tried and convicted on the original territorial charges in addition to the Colorado matter, and sentenced to 7 years. The 2 principals named in Drummond's testimony settled civilly rather than face criminal charges and paid restitution to the affected property owners, which in some cases covered what was lost, and in other cases fell short in ways that money couldn't fully address. The 11 properties, over time, were returned to clear title. It was not clean or quick. For some families, it took long enough that the original owners had moved on, and the resolution arrived like a letter addressed to a person who had already left. But it arrived. Old Pemberton died in the spring following, not from anything dramatic, simply from being 72 and tired, in the way of people who have held on long enough to see a thing resolved and then let go. His sons ran the property after him and ran it competently, which was what he'd always wanted. At the funeral, which most of the valley attended, his eldest son said that in his father's last months the old man had talked frequently about the town meeting, about the moment he'd raised his hand and said he'd almost signed. He'd seemed to find something in that small act of witness, the saying of what he'd almost done, that meant more to him than he'd fully explained. Evelyn heard that and was quiet for a while after. He was scared, she said to Colt that evening. He was scared and he came anyway, and he said the true thing in front of 60 people. Yes, Colt said. That's harder than it looks, she said. Most people don't know that until they have to do it. She went back to what she was doing. A bridle that needed stitching, her hands working with the automatic competence of long practice, and the lamp threw its steady light across the table, and the October dark pressed against the windows, and the valley outside was quiet and cold, and running with new water in its creek beds. He watched her work and thought about the gathering in August, a lifetime ago it felt like, and the moment she had looked him in the eye and told him to stay away. He'd thought at the time it was a rebuff. He understood now it was the first honest thing anyone had said to him in years. Not a rejection, but an act of respect. The kind that expects you to be capable of hearing the truth about someone's situation instead of just their availability. She had told him who she was and what she needed before he'd had the chance to assume anything. He'd been lucky enough to listen, The Double M and the Heart training operation formally merged the following spring under a partnership agreement that Evelyn had written out herself in her precise, unadorned handwriting and that Colt had signed without revising a word. They hired 2 more hands, they expanded the training corral and built a new barn, properly, with lumber and time, on the east side of the property. The roan horse with trust issues turned out to be one of the best animals Evelyn had ever trained. Once he decided to make up his mind about it, that was the thing about the valley, and the people in it, and the year that had changed them. The good outcomes were not the result of anyone being particularly noble or far-seeing. They were the result of a woman who refused to stop being right, and a man who was stubborn enough to listen to her, and a handful of ordinary, imperfect people who showed up to a meeting and raised their hands when it mattered. That was all it had ever taken. That was all it ever takes. The ridge stood over the valley the same as it always had. The water ran. The land remained. And in the spring, when the grass came back green and full after the long dry year, you could almost forget how close it had all come to being something else entirely. Almost. But not quite, which was probably the right distance to keep it.